This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Well, tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for this evening. My good friend and colleague Gary Segura is a professor of American politics and the chair of Chicano Studies, and he's in the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. He is one of our newest colleagues. He just joined the faculty this year. He received his PhD in American politics and political philosophy from the University of Illinois, and he previously has taught at the University of California at Davis, at Claremont Graduate University, the University of Iowa, and the University of Washington most recently. His work focuses on issues of political representation and currently is focusing on the accessibility of government and politics to America's growing Latino community, as well as a book-length project on the links between the casualties in international conflicts and domestic politics. Among his recent publications are The Mobilizing Effect of Majority-Minority Districts in Latino Turnout and Su Casa es Nuestra Casa, Latino Politics, Research and the Development of American Political Science. Both of those appeared in the American Political Science Review. He's also the author of Earthquakes and Aftershocks, Race, Direct Democracy, and Partisan Change, and Race and Recall Polarization in the California Recall Election. And both these articles appeared in another leading journal in political science, the American Journal of Political Science. His work has been funded on numerous occasions by the National Science Foundation, and he is the current president-elect of the Midwest Political Science Association, and he also serves on the Board of Overseers for the American National Election Survey. So please welcome Professor Gary Segura.
First, I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here tonight. As Matt mentioned, this is my first quarter here at Stanford University, and I find both the intellectual stimulation and, frankly, the weather to be quite nice after 3 years in Seattle. They say it only rains once a year in Seattle from October to May. Tonight, we have a distinguished panel of experts from a variety of fields who have both direct connection with the politics of race and gender, and also with a variety of intellectual and disciplinary perspectives to bring to bear tonight. And so I hope you will enjoy their comments. I'm sure you will. Our first speaker tonight is one of my colleagues here at Stanford, Professor Shanto Iyengar. Shanto is the Chandler Chair of Communication and a Professor of Political Science here at Stanford University. He is the author of several books, including News That Matters and Is Anyone Responsible? Since 2006, he has contributed a regular research column to WashingtonPost.com. He is the recipient of several professional awards, including the Phil Converse Award for the best book in the field of public opinion, the Edelman Career Award, and the Goldsmith Book Prize from Harvard University. On a personal note, Shanto was actually an office mate of my dissertation advisor when they were in graduate school. So one of the many reasons that I chose to come to Stanford is to be able to have a colleague as distinguished and as frankly bright as he is. And so I learn something every time I have a conversation with him. So please join me in welcoming Shanto Iyengar.
Thanks very much, Gary. And it's a. Let me see if I can. Okay, I think that's pretty well adjusted. Well, so thanks, Gary, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And now Gary has indicated that the participants can speak for approximately 15 minutes, and I'll try and, in fact, I'll make a point of abiding by that stricture. I did not, unfortunately, bring any PowerPoint with me, and so I'm just going to give you a fairly structured presentation on what I believe are the significant lessons to be learned from this historic campaign, historic on multiple dimensions, including gender, clearly the presence of Senator Clinton in the primaries, but most notably the continued success through from what we can tell, at least through just about the verge of the election the continued success of Senator Obama. What does that tell us then about the role of race in a major presidential contest? It's something that we have absolutely no good systematic evidence on the question of just how will race play out in a major campaign. We have some data from statewide races, and we also have some data from let's say, the Jesse Jackson campaign back in the 1980s, but certainly nothing, we've never seen a candidate with the sort of the strength and the ability to accumulate both public support and huge amounts of fundraising, obviously. So at any rate, I'm going to talk a little bit about what does this tell us about the way in which campaigns are waged, which means I'm going to focus for the first part of my presentation on campaign strategy. And secondly, I'll address the question or questions which many of the pundits and commentators in the media have been opining about at great length concerning what's the potential impact of a black candidate on the response of the electorate. And so there, of course, we get into this debate about is there a genuine so-called Bradley effect in which we have people who are, let's say, overstating their level of support for Senator Obama in a polling contest when they're actually revealing their preference to someone else, and might that revealed preference be somewhat at odds with their true preference when it comes time to actually go into the polling place? So that's an interesting question, and so I'll say a little bit about that. We actually have some evidence on that score. Okay, so let me begin then with this whole question about how does race play out in the context of campaign strategy? I think we all, those of us who study presidential politics would sort of say you need to go back to 1988. 1988 was really where the textbook was written on the use of so-called wedge appeals. Wedge appeals referring to the strategy on the part of typically Republican candidates to try and peel off Democratic voters on the basis of race. So in 1988, we had the infamous television commercial, now referred to as the Willie Horton commercial, in which a group that was backing Vice President Bush's candidacy ran an ad in which it really featured a prison furlough program in Massachusetts. And the prison furlough program, it's a program in which prison inmates are allowed to go home on the weekend. And in one incident involving an African-American inmate whose name was William Horton, he committed a particularly heinous crime while on furlough, and that became the subject of a 30-second television commercial in which, of course, the point was made that Governor Dukakis supports prison furlough programs, and if you support Governor Dukakis, well, obviously, you're soft on crime. And so that ad was front-page news all across the country. It generated a huge amount of publicity for the Bush campaign, and it propelled issues of race, specifically the linking of race and crime, into the public spotlight. And the conventional wisdom has it that when the Dukakis ad aired, when the Bush, the third-party ad supporting Vice President Bush aired, Governor Dukakis was leading in the polls by a fairly substantial margin, between 8 and 10 percentage points. And then it turns out that after the Horton ad ran and a series of other events occurred, Governor Dukakis's advantage in the polls dissipated, and he was very rapidly overtaken, and in the end, we all know what happened. So the conventional wisdom is that the insertion of the Horton ad, and specifically the insertion of this very explicit racial signal, served to divert a substantial body of white Democrats away from Dukakis in the direction of a Republican vote. Now, 1988 is just one sort of vivid example, but if you do your history, you can go further back and talk about the law and order appeals in the 1960s with Nixon and others. So there's a long tradition of this sort of the use of racial cues to attempt to divert Democrats, white Democrats, from otherwise voting their normal partisanship and supporting the Democratic nominee. So, in the aftermath of 1988, we've had several changes to the rules. I don't mean the actual institutional rules, but I mean the informal rules governing the way in which journalists in particular cover campaigns. In 1988, the Willie Horton ad was essentially treated as news in its own right. Journalists talked about the content of that ad. They talked about the fact that Willie Horton had indeed committed this crime, and they talked about the implications of what that meant for the election. There was no one in the world of journalism who saw fit to debunk the Willie Horton ad. No one pointed out, for instance, that in 1988, Vice President Bush, as the sitting incumbent vice president, presumably would have some responsibility for the furlough program in the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia, just like every other criminal jurisdiction, furlough programs are standard. And it turns out the Massachusetts program had a very good track record in terms of its statistical profile. And so, but no one pointed any of this out. It's only in the aftermath of the 1988 campaign that we've witnessed a sea change in the way journalists treat political advertising. And today, as you're probably all well aware of this, there is no ad that is not subjected to the so-called the ad watching of well-known news organizations, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and several others. So today, when a candidate runs an ad, particularly an ad that's controversial or which features messages that are as potentially divisive as the Willie Horton ad, you have a plethora of analysts who are there to put that message in some appropriate context, who are there to point out the various distortions and the exaggerations and the sort of attempting to sort of reveal the strategy of the sponsoring candidate. And I believe that has, to a certain degree, has acted as a sort of a deterrent. So if you look at, in this cycle, if you look at the advertising and if you look at, in general, the campaign rhetoric, I think you will find that there has been a somewhat subdued attempt to play the race card. I'm not saying that the candidates didn't do it. Indeed, I'm going to argue precisely the opposite. Both the Clinton campaign and the McCain campaign have resorted to race in their campaigning. But as I say, it has been at a fairly subdued, let's say, at a fairly subtle level. In the case, let's turn to the primaries. In the case of Senator Clinton, I think it was clear, after it became clear that she faced a very serious challenger in Senator Obama. At the outset, when Senator Clinton declared her candidacy, I don't believe she had even in her wildest dreams, did she ever anticipate that Senator Obama would actually defeat her in Iowa and then become the front-running threat that he turned out to be. So at that point, they obviously had to do something to try and regain the advantage. And they turned to a series of surrogates. So if you track the rhetoric from the Clinton campaign, beginning in Iowa, I'm not going to give you the exact examples here, but there are several concrete instances of Clinton surrogates making references to Senator Obama's past, most notably his admitted drug use during his youth. There were comments made about his ability to appeal to black voters, and former President Bill Clinton made the famous comment about the South Carolina primary in which he compared Senator Obama's performance there with Jesse Jackson's showing 20 years ago, even though the two cases were quite dramatically different. So there were a series of comments like that which led some commentators to argue that indeed the Clinton campaign was playing the race card. And later on, as the campaign dragged on, as the primary campaign dragged on, there were other cases in which Senator Clinton postured or positioned herself as the sort of the candidate of the working class voter, when many felt she was really saying that she was the candidate of the working class white voter. So in the primaries, I think we can make the argument that there was some use, sustained use of wedge appeals. Now, in the general election campaign, I don't think there's any doubt. If you look at the rhetoric of Governor Palin in particular, there's been a fairly systematic attempt to depict Senator Obama as out of the mainstream. Certainly, the term palling around with terrorists may not convey an explicit racial signal, but it certainly suggests something concerning ethnicity, perhaps, or certainly something concerning religion. We have actually done a fairly comprehensive tracking of the ways in which Senator Obama is depicted in the McCain campaign's advertising. And so by that I mean we have taken every single still image of Senator Obama that appears in Senator Obama's ad campaign. And the nice thing about modern technology, and this is where I wish I had brought a PowerPoint, the nice thing about Photoshop in particular is that you can put in these stills and Photoshop will just spit out some very precise quantitative indicators of skin color. So you can ask the question, how does Senator Obama's skin color evolve in the course of the presidential ad campaign, at least through the eyes of the McCain-Palin ad campaign? And I don't think anyone here would be surprised if I pointed out that there's a very interesting trend in the complexion of Senator Obama in the context of the McCain ad campaign. And no, he's definitely not getting any lighter. So indeed, there's if you track these Photoshop readings over time, you see that after September the 15th, and it's not a coincidence, September 15th was the stock market, the explosion on the financial crisis. It's especially post-September 15th that you see the most ominous type of images of Senator Obama in the McCain ads. So clearly, if you do this kind of analysis of the visual element in the Obama ad campaign, you see that race is a factor, and that the McCain campaign does indeed have a systematic strategy here of attempting to depict Obama in fairly explicit racial terms. Okay, let me turn now to the second half of the argument. So we've seen that indeed when you have a black candidate on the ballot for contesting in a very serious way the highest office in this land, white candidates have a fairly significant incentive to use racial appeals against their black opponent. So what's the payoff then? Well, in the question, in the primary, it's difficult to argue in the primary campaign since we know that race went down to the wire, and so you might argue that indeed Senator Clinton's appeals, her resorting to racial appeals, may have had some positive benefits to her candidacy. I'm going to focus mainly now on the general election question, so the so-called Bradley effect, or perhaps the opposite of the Bradley effect, which is that maybe the black turnout is going to be so high because of the presence of a black candidate, you might have some sort of an offsetting bias in favor of Senator Obama. Let me give you a couple of observations on where I believe the election will turn, at least in terms of this question of what impact will race have on people's preferences. Well, the first point of evidence I will cite is a study that we did with my Stanford colleague Doug Rivers has a market research firm which actually does mainly political research. This is the firm called Polymetrics. Polymetrics did this study in February, just before the South Carolina primary. And what they did was they presented a fairly representative sample of Democrats and independents across the country. They presented them with three different representations, photographic images of Senator Obama. One in which it's the actual Senator Obama, and the two others were manipulated, morphed essentially to alter the skin complexion so that he appeared either somewhat lighter or somewhat darker. And then he was presented side by side with his two main opponents at that time, John Edwards and Hillary Clinton. Well, to make a long story short, at that time in the campaign, Senator Obama was a relatively newcomer. Not very many people knew much about Senator Obama. Not knowing that much about him, you might argue that the racial cue was indeed somewhat relevant. And in fact, we found a small but statistically significant effect in the expected direction. So when people encountered the darker version of Senator Obama, they were less likely to indicate that they would support him by about 2.5 percentage points. So if there was going to be a Bradley effect in that sense, where you might argue that people were discouraged from supporting Senator Obama because the racial cue was more apparent, was more salient, it would be on the order of magnitude of between 2 or 3 percentage points. Now remember, that was way back in February. We replicated this exact same design just a couple of weeks ago, so I can't give you any details except to report what my colleague Simon Jackman has indicated. He has looked at the data, and he indicates that there's absolutely no evidence of any effect of the visual manipulation. So it suggests that over time, as people become more familiar with an African-American candidate and they can fill in the blanks about where does he stand on the issues, and they've had 3 debates in which they've actually gotten to know Senator Obama pretty well, and they've fleshed out their impressions of Senator Obama. So by late September, early October, the question of skin color has become somewhat secondary, perhaps even irrelevant. So if there was a generalization here that I would offer, it would be that the racial cue is particularly important when the candidate is relatively unfamiliar. Once white voters become more familiar with the African American candidate, questions about race and ethnicity recede into the background, especially when you have the kind of scenario that we're facing today in this country, namely the imminent prospects of economic gloom and doom. So when you've got everyone concerned about their pocketbook and their IRAs and their stock market, the value of their stock market holdings, the election really becomes a question of dollars and cents, and not a question of white versus black. So I guess what I'm leading up to the conclusion that this is a fairly unusual. It's sort of there's a profound irony here. Because in terms of race and ethnicity and identity politics, this is probably the most interesting campaign of all time, given the cast of characters that we've witnessed from Senator Clinton to Senator Obama. Yet, despite the presence of the first really significant African-American contender for the American presidency, I'm arguing that in the end, racial factors and racial cues are going to be completely dominated and trumped by the more mundane concerns facing most Americans, concerns about economic security and concerns about their material well-being.
There's a book really about the Willie Horton ad, which I know you know as well as I do, by a scholar named Tali Mendelberg called The Race Card. And in the book, she makes the argument, quite persuasively I think, that racial politics is quite effective, but only when it sort of flies under the radar screen, that when racial appeals become obvious, then particularly sort of middle-of-the-road voters feel deeply uncomfortable with it, and it actually has no effect or even an off-putting effect. And so that raises a rather interesting question when the nominee is in fact an African American. Is it possible then that raising sort of a racial subtext to the election is not only less likely to be effective, but in fact can't work when, ironically, when the nominee is black? That is, that racial politics works best when it's 2 white candidates running against each other and trying to elicit racial hostility. So it's sort of ironic, and I want to kind of hear your
Well, I think Tali is right. I think the Mendelberg analysis is correct, that when it is made transparent, number one, that's why I talked about the Willie Horton ad, because the press sat back and allowed that to go on without calling the Bush campaign on it, even though it was a third-party ad. It wasn't the Bush campaign airing the ad, but the press pretty much gave them a free ride and simply recycled the message. Today, that's not going to be possible because everyone's going to jump on you right away if you're the candidate using obviously race-based appeal. And so that's why the candidates have had to resort to a fairly more subtle higher order approach. And so this palling around with terrorists does not suggest race per se, but it's more likely to invoke questions about nationality, questions about, where is this guy really from? And so, so I would agree with the bottom line here that it's become more difficult, if you will, for candidates who wish to play the race card.
Okay, I want to be cautious about the conclusion then that race may be dominated by other factors, because the absence of a Bradley effect or the success, should Senator Obama go on to win the election, would certainly be evidence that race does not trump all other considerations. But don't we have to consider that race might be implicit in some of the basic ideological orientations of the American public? We have known for some time that opposition to the welfare state, opposition to government services, at least in certain parts of the country, can really be understood by racial animus. That is, you get people whose own economic circumstances are actually quite limiting and quite challenging, but will still vote against economic policies that might benefit them in large measure because they think those policies are racially tinged.
Well, I mean, that's a fine comment. That's a genuine challenge. I wasn't meaning, let me first of all point out that I taught at UCLA for 12 years before coming to Stanford, and David Sears, my UCLA colleague, is the person who coined the term symbolic racism, which is precisely the argument that Gary's making, that new forms of racism are disguised and that people are now using proxies for race, so opposition to welfare, opposition to the kind of behavior that was embodied with the Willie Horton ad. So yes, I should have been more cautious in what I was trying to say in my conclusion was that I don't think that this election is going to be determined by race per se, simply because of the circumstances of the moment. But let me put it in a more jargon, political science kind of terminology, which I know Gary would be comfortable with. We have these standard forecasting models in political science. There are about 6 or 7 different people who have come up with very specific prediction models. And my favorite model is the one, another colleague, former colleague of mine, Alan Abramowitz, has come up with this. It's called time for a change, the time for a change forecasting model. Essentially, the argument goes when one party has been in office for 8 years and they've really screwed up, which is the case with the current situation, people tend to basically vote out the incumbents. And Alan Abramowitz's model, which also factors in the state of the economy, he's predicting that Senator Obama will get 54.5% of the popular vote. So that's a fairly healthy victory, according to the Abramowitz model. I am not that sanguine, so I'm going to agree with Gary that I don't believe Senator Obama is going to get 54.5%. I believe there is a slight race penalty. And I threw out that number. In February, we found that the penalty was 2.5 percentage points. In September, it seems to be much smaller. It seems to be, apparently it seems to have gone away. But I would say instead of 54.5, 54.48, it's probably going to be 51, 51.5 in that vicinity. So I do think that there is the potential for that kind of backlash. And in the end, I believe it will be closer than these models predict.
Great. We don't disagree. I just had to sort of prove
I know.
And I'm comfortable with regular people language. I don't need political science jargon.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
All right. Thank you, Professor Iyengar. Our second presenter tonight is a longtime friend and visitor for the Center for Comparative Studies of Race and Ethnicity, and that's Professor Valerie Smith. Valerie is director of the Center for African American Studies and the Woodrow Wilson Professor of Literature in the Department of English at Princeton University. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships, including the Guggenheim, the National Endowment for Humanities Fellowship, the Alphonse Fletcher Fellowship, and is the author of Self-Discovery and Authority in Afro-American Narrative, and sort of appropriate for tonight's topic, Not Just Race, Not Just Gender, Black Feminist Readings. She has written numerous articles on African American literature, black film, black feminist politics, and she's the editor of African American Writers, Representing Blackness, Issues in Film and Video. At present, she's writing a book on the cultural memory of the Civil Rights Movement and on Toni Morrison. Please join me in welcoming Professor Valerie Smith.
Good evening. I'd like to thank Professors Snip and Elam for inviting me to speak on this panel. We've been asked to reflect on the topic group affiliation and political position, race and gender, with specific reference to two issues: who we are and how we vote, and key issues attributed to specific populations. Now, like many of you here this evening, I have way too much to say about race and gender in relation to this current election cycle. So I want to thank Professors Snip and Elam for the guidance they've given us, and I'm trying my best to stay on message. Okay, conventional wisdom would have it that in integrated contexts, members of subordinated groups stick together. Like follows like. The logical extension of that assumption is that black voters are expected to support black candidates. Especially when it comes to black candidates, the parenthetical phrase that often follows that assumption, sometimes implicit but often explicitly articulated, would be, and I quote, whatever their qualifications. President George H.W. Bush's nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court 27 years ago provides a salient example of this topic, of this logic. By nominating a black conservative, 17 years ago, not 27, I'm sorry. By nominating a black conservative, he figured that he could get a conservative nominee through the confirmation process, silence the Senate liberals, and potentially even score points with black voters. He assumed that despite Thomas's positions on civil rights and his opposition to abortion rights, Senate Democrats would be reluctant to oppose him for fear of alienating their African American constituents. And indeed, according to a USA Today poll in 1991, 54% of African Americans supported the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, his inexperience and his opposition to affirmative action and abortion rights notwithstanding. After Anita Hill's allegations of sexual harassment, that percentage grew even higher. At that juncture in history, the first President Bush could assume that African Americans would support an African American nominee because of his race rather than because of his positions. Now, since that time, I believe that the electorate of all races has grown less vulnerable to that sort of manipulation. In the 2006 elections, for example, the Republican Party ran 3 African American men for statewide office: Ohio Secretary of State Kenneth Blackwell for governor, broadcaster Lynn Swann for governor of Pennsylvania, and Maryland Lieutenant Governor Michael Steele for the Senate, in hopes of pulling black voters away from the Democratic Party. But Blackwell was unable to overcome his own record. As both chief elections official of Ohio and honorary co-chair of the committee to re-elect George W. Bush during the 2004 presidential election, he was on the receiving end of numerous allegations of conflicts of interest and voter disfranchisement. All 3 men, Blackwell, Steele, and Swann, failed to attract the black voters that the GOP had hoped to target. Running on platforms that were either short on specifics or that promoted tax cuts and spending cuts for social programs, all 3 lost decisively. Now, the current campaign has given us many opportunities to reflect upon the relationship between a candidate's identity, the positions we associate with that identity, and his or her likely constituency. Let me recap a few highlights. 1, Senator Obama's campaign caught fire after his surprise upset in Iowa, a state with a 2.7% African American population. His ability to attract widespread support among white Midwesterners demonstrated his electability to voters of all races in every region of the country. 2, many men and women of all races who considered themselves feminists withheld their support from Senator Clinton because of her position on the Iraq War, the tone and tactics of her campaign, and our pressing domestic needs. For them, these issues outweighed their desire to see a woman in the White House. As the petition circulated by Feminists for Peace and Barack Obama, a multiracial national group of signatories, indicated, and I quote, "War and peace are as much women's issues as are health, the environment, and the achievement of educational and occupational equality." 3. Senator McCain is widely believed to have picked Governor Palin as his running mate, both because he thought her religious affiliation and firm anti-choice convictions would appeal to Republican social conservatives, and because of her gender. He seems to have thought that white women, potentially even disappointed supporters of Senator Clinton, would flock to his ticket because of her. Instead, her inexperience, her anti-choice stance, her position on global warming, the questionable ethics of her leadership style as mayor of Wasilla and as governor of Alaska, among other factors, may well cost him the election. Her presence on the ticket may not swing the white women he targeted into the Obama camp, but it may keep them from voting at all. Indeed, according to a recent article in the New York Times, even at the height of her popularity, Governor Palin's favorability ratings were higher among men than they were among women. Senator Obama is regularly identified with a new generation of black leadership. In his August 10, 2008 cover story in the New York Times magazine entitled, quote, "Is Obama the End of Black Politics?" Matt Bai describes earlier so-called black leaders this way, and I quote, "Black leaders who rose to political power in the years after the civil rights marches came almost entirely from the pulpit and the movement, and they have always defined leadership in broad terms as speaking for Black Americans. They saw their job, principally, as confronting an inherently racist white establishment, which in terms of sheer career advancement was their only real option anyway. In contrast," Bai continues, "this newly emerging class of black politicians, men and a few women closer in age to Obama and Jesse Jackson Jr., seek a broader political brief. Comfortable inside the establishment, bred at universities rather than seminaries, they are just as likely to see themselves as ambassadors to the black community as they are to see themselves as spokesmen for it, which often means extolling middle-class values in urban neighborhoods. Their ambitions range well beyond safely black seats," end of quote. Now, along with Gary Young, Eric Foner, and others, I have mixed feelings about this desire to announce the end of one generation of leaders and the arrival of a new one. These kinds of tidy narratives produce neat sound bites, but historical change is rarely this orderly. Every second or third generation announces itself as new, a break from the past. Historical distance enables us to see continuities as well as distinctions that may not be evident in the moment. But with that caveat, we cannot deny that Senator Obama is a different kind of candidate, running a different kind of presidential campaign than his predecessors, black or white. He is certainly different because he and his organization have revolutionized the ways in which presidential campaigns have been run in this country. They've raised record amounts of money, they've mounted and sustained a 50-state strategy with offices in communities that have rarely, if ever, seen a Democrat's campaign headquarters, and they've made unprecedented use of the internet not only to raise money, but to organize their supporters, refute fallacious attack ads, circulate advertising, and create virtual as well as face-to-face communities. And of course, it goes without saying that as the son of a black Kenyan father and a white American mother, he is certainly different from any other candidate who has run before. For some commentators and members of the general public, his mixed-race, transnational identity is a physical sign that contemporary American culture has so quote-unquote transcended race. Indeed, I'm sure we've all heard or read that Senator Obama's success is due to the fact that not only is he brilliant, blessed with a gift for oratory, and photogenic, but that he transcends race. Now, what might people mean by this notion of transcending race? They may simply be responding to Senator Obama's signature rhetorical flourish, first heard widely when he spoke at the 2004 Democratic Convention that, quote, "There is not a liberal America and a conservative America, there is the United States of America. There is not a black America and a white America, Latino America and Asian America, there is the United States of America." This formulation foreshadowed his desire to run on an inclusive platform rather than to speak for or to identify with issues primarily associated with African American voters, to reach out across divisions and represent all Americans. Some voters and commentators might well see this strategy as a form of race transcendence. Or they may mean that his record-breaking fundraising and his ability to reach voters across the nation is a sign that he transcends race. From their perspective, these achievements may signal that we have become the kind of society in which a candidate can be judged by the content of his character or the content of his platform and not the color of his skin. I think all of these interpretations come into play when people say that Obama transcends race, that in some way or other he transcends race and that he enables Americans to believe that they transcend race. Now, I'm not convinced that race transcendence is something after which we should all strive, especially since I really don't know what it means for all those people who champion it as a goal. And I certainly don't think that either Senator Obama or contemporary American culture has transcended race. As Gary Young wrote in The Nation in January, and I quote, "Candidates can talk about transcending race, gender, region, and party all they like. But before we can talk about transcending difference, we must first transform the conditions that gave those differences meaning. To get beyond race, we must first get rid of racism." Now, I won't recount the litany of racist attacks and insinuations to which Senator Obama and his family have been submitted that we know about because I won't recount the litany of racist attacks and insinuations to which Senator Obama and his family have been submitted that we know about because they've been released to the media. But as Representative John Lewis asserted after the series of McCain-Palin rallies in which their supporters hurled racist and xenophobic attacks at Obama, they are, quote, sowing the seeds of hatred and division. Lewis went on to say, "George Wallace never threw a bomb, he never fired a gun, but he created the climate and the conditions that encouraged vicious attacks against innocent Americans who only desired to exercise their constitutional rights." As public figures with power to influence and persuade, Senator McCain and Governor Palin are playing with fire, and if they're not careful, that fire will consume us all. End of quote. But of course, the evidence that we haven't transcended race extends beyond this campaign. Even an Obama presidency can't mean that we have transcended race and the legacy of racial oppression as long as public schools depend disproportionately on residential property taxes for funding, as long as repressive police tactics and inequitable sentencing guidelines result in the disproportionate incarceration of people of color, as long as people of color are disproportionately victimized by predatory lending practices, and as long as people of color are more susceptible to environmental toxins and substandard health care than their white counterparts. If those who want to transcend race mean that they want to transcend racism and the host of injustices with which it is inextricably connected, poverty, sexism, educational and health disparities, and so on, then I'm all for it. But if what they mean is that by transcending race is that we agree to stop acknowledging racial and ethnic differences and will ourselves to forget our specific yet deeply interconnected histories, then I want no part of it. For while the history of race in this country is the source of some of our most traumatic wounds, it has also given us much of which we can be proud. We want to remember, to celebrate, to draw inspiration from, and we want future generations to remember, celebrate, and draw inspiration from the extraordinary contributions in science and technology, education, literature and the performing arts, popular culture, business, law, religion, oratory, visual arts, politics, and virtually every profession and form of expression by those who have consistently been seen as less than human. We want to remember, to celebrate, and draw inspiration from the sacrifices, the courage, and the faith of those on whose shoulders we stand, even if their names are lost to history. For me, Toni Morrison provides a useful counterpoint to this notion of race transcendence in her essay entitled Home, where she writes, "How to be free and situated, how to convert a racist house into a race-specific yet non-racist home, how to enunciate race while depriving it of its lethal cling. They are questions of concept, of language, of trajectory, of habitation, of occupation. And although that is Morrison's engagement with them has been fierce, fitful, and constantly evolving, they remain in my thoughts as aesthetically and politically unresolved," end of quote. Now, it's frequently said that films and television shows and books about African Americans and other people of color don't succeed because they target a niche market and white viewers and readers don't cross over to support them. But people of color regularly watch, enjoy, and identify with movies and shows and works of literature that feature whites. We've gotten quite adept at looking at the lives of white people and seeing the joys and sorrows, hopes and disappointments, blessings and tragedies that constitute our common humanity. I look forward to the day when all Americans can witness the lives and the culture of people who differ from us and see our common humanity in them. My colleague Melissa Harris Lacewell put it best in the entry she wrote for the blog she shares with Yolanda Pierce, a blog called The Kitchen Table, the day after the final debate. And I want to quote here from Melissa's entry to that blog. Joe the plumber is a real American, white, male, family man, laborer, and potential entrepreneur. Never mind that he is also unlicensed, behind on his taxes, and related to the notorious Keating. Nearly 24 times during the last debate, McCain and Obama looked directly into the camera and addressed Joe's issues. No one, not once, not ever even considered the possibility of talking to Melissa, the professor. Melissa is a woman. I'm still quoting from her blog. Melissa is a woman. She is black, divorced, and raising a child without consistent financial support from the father. She is extremely well educated, lives on the East Coast, and makes a good salary. Despite her education and decent income and all her wealth, despite her education and decent income, all her wealth is tied up in her home, and she still worries about how to care for her aging mother, whose retirement has been wiped out in the Wall Street crash this month. No candidate thinks it is relevant to talk to Melissa the professor because she lives in a safe blue state and has supported Obama from the beginning. She is not a swing voter, so she is not a topic of conversation in the debates. But it is more than that. The deeper alienation emerges from the sense that Melissa is not representative of quote-unquote real Americans. Presumably, real Americans don't read books or the New York Times. They don't control their own fertility. They don't make up their minds more than 12 hours before a major national election. Real Americans don't call the plumber, they are the plumber. Real Americans are not descended from American slaves. They are not black, and their hair is not nappy. Barack does not look into the camera and decry racism because we are not really Americans. We are not allowed to express our political needs or tell our political histories because when we do, it makes other people feel uncomfortable. African Americans are still supposed to be grateful for being saved from the quote-unquote savagery of Africa, civilized by the cross, offered the crumbs of capitalism, and given the chance to die for the flag. Our sacrifices and our suffering are still elective courses, not required reading. Barack does not talk to Melissa the professor because if he did, he would be labeled a special interest politician, even though worrying about Joe the plumber is somehow universal. Barack does not mention that he is under special attack because of his race, because silence about America's racial legacy is the price of admission to the social contract. End of quote. Senator Obama's candidacy need not be seen as an opportunity for Americans to look at him and his family and transcend race, not see race or see beyond race. Rather, an Obama presidency allows us a chance to acknowledge the myriad ways in which race has operated in and shaped the American experiment. His presidency, allows Americans to be able to imagine an African American head of state and an African American first family as symbols of American democracy, symbols that are both racially specific and universal at once. The language of race transcendence seems to characterize Obama as American despite the fact that he is black. I see in him a cosmopolitan figure ready to take his place on the world stage, a candidate who is unashamedly black and undeniably American. Thank you.
Once again, if you have questions for the panelists, please pass those questions on the cards to the end of the rows, and the TA will collect them. I love the talk, and I want to raise a couple of questions that I think have been percolating in the minds of those of us who study race and ethnicity for a living. And one particular question is the fear question. And the fear question is that the election of Barack Obama might present a danger to minority political interests in that it would allow white Americans to once again declare victory over racism. Yay, it's all done. And then serve as a justification for abandonment of various public policies that would be consistent with racial redress and removing inequality in American society. And I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts or comments on that.
Well, I certainly share that concern, as do many people who are watching this. Sorry, who are watching this campaign closely. I think that's why, for many of us, we feel that winning the election is the start, is just the beginning, and continuing to focus our attention upon the kinds of issues that I enumerated is crucial for all of us. It seems to me that one might consider the fact that one way of thinking about the fortuitousness of the moment, the fact that we're in a sort of national economic crisis, is the fact that so many of the issues that African Americans and other people of color, other disenfranchised communities in this country face are now issues with which the entire country wrestles. And it seems to me that I went back in preparing for this presentation to Senator Obama's More Perfect Union speech. And one of the things that I noticed that I had not seen before in that speech is the fact that he sort of challenges African Americans and whites to think about their common ground as we confront problems of mutual interest for all of us. So it seems to me we've got to continue to keep his feet to the fire, his administration's feet to the fire, and recognizing that that these issues which have been so tenacious in our culture are going to be even harder to confront and to deal with in the context of an economic crisis. But I think you're entirely right, and I think we have to make sure that his victory doesn't usher in a period of retrenchment. So I think I'll stop
Great,
there.
thank you very much. Thank you again for the talk. Our third panelist for tonight is Susan Andersen. Susan is a professor of psychology in the Department of Psychology at NYU and formerly the head of the doctoral program in social psychology. She was recruited to NYU with tenure in 1987 after having been on the faculty at UC Santa Barbara. Her PhD is from here, Stanford University, and she was promoted to full professor in 1994. She's received federal research grants from the National Institute of Mental Health, among others, have served on federal grant panels, and has been the associate editor of the flagship journal in her field, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, as well as of the premier journal in psychology, Sociological Review. She's now the associate editor of Self and Identity. She's a fellow of the American Psychological Society, the American Psychological Association, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and has received numerous teaching awards. She also worked on an informal basis with the White House in the 1990s and was informally associated with the Hillary Clinton campaign this year. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Susan Andersen.
Okay, well, good evening. I'm absolutely delighted to be here at my alma mater, where I have not been for a very long time. Because my expertise is in social psychology and really social cognition, social perception, I want to focus tonight on the psychological science and what it tells us about how men and women are perceived. So I'm going to be talking about gender, particularly, and particularly the issue of how women are perceived when they are in leadership positions. For starters, what we might do is just ask how, if I can get that off the screen here, let's see, there, how some of the best known women in the world who have served as heads of state have been perceived. So just to give you a feel for this, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, as you will recall, or Attila the Hun. Golda Meir, the only man in the cabinet. Indira Gandhi, the old witch. Angela Merkel, now, the Iron Frau. And now Hillary Clinton in the primaries, the man in this race, she was frequently referred to. And at a store near you, you will find the Hillary Nutcracker when you bring out your holiday nut bowl, if you do such things. And I'm sure you can guess which limbs she used to crack those nuts, or that somebody uses to crack them. So that's a collector's item by now, obviously. And as a quick reminder, I wanted to give you a very tiny sampling, 1 minute really, of a little montage of sort of media clips to just remind you of some of the things that were said at various times in the campaign.
Big news from New Hampshire tonight is it cries. After spending decades stripping away all trace of emotion, femininity, and humanity, Hillary Clinton actually broke down and actually cried yesterday on the campaign trail. Men won't vote for Hillary Clinton because she reminds them of their nagging lies. And when Hillary Clinton speaks, men hear, "Hey, I forgot it." Let me tell you how short Hillary's leash is. If you're a guy going door to door trying to sell something, and she said, "You'll have to wait for my husband to get home." Whenever she does something super, I think she actually is tough. But the one thing we learned from the Raina Bottom case is there's a great deal of resentment among women aimed at men. Look, we always use Hillary Clinton as no kind of establishment. White women are a problem with this. It seems like Chelsea's sort of being pinned down in some weird sort of way. When she reacts, the way she reacts to Obama, with just the look to it, looking like everyone's first wife standing outside of the She's trying to run away from this tough, kind of bitchy image. I can see her there. Give me a bag of cool cigarettes, will you? Let's not forget.
That's it.
And I'll be brutal. The reason she's a U.S. Senator.
Cut. Okay, so, well, he was just going to, what was he going to say? Geez, let's not forget that the only reason that she is in politics at all is because people felt sorry for her because of what Bill did to her in the election. Let's face it, that's the reason she got elected. People felt sorry for her. And, you know, Tim Russert is like looking away and smiling, trying to not take too much pleasure in it. But, okay, so, all right, so you've already switched it. Okay, so in any event, one may counter the idea that this is somehow gender biased by saying that, you know, as a candidate in the Democratic primaries, the fact is she won the popular vote, and that she won, in fact, more votes in a primary than has ever been won in United States history. So really, and of course she lost the nomination because of the delegate count, which is the metric that matters. But the point is it was split right down the middle. So how bad can it be for women, one might ask? Well, by now, it's nearly a truism in science, in behavioral science, that people's gut reactions, their emotional responses, their first sort of emotional responses to people in social judgment really occur quite automatically, and and frequently outside of people's awareness. So they frequently don't really know why they feel what they feel. And certainly most people or many people would not want that to be biased, whether it's about race or whether it's about gender. But the bottom line is that the categories to which people belong basically leap out at us from the world and leap to the fore in our perception. And whatever the messages are that are being communicated are essentially interpreted through the lens of those categories. So in the end, stereotyping and prejudice can drive, and frequently do drive, the instantaneous emotional reactions that we have to people. So the bottom line is that both race and gender are categories, and many of you may have heard of the very famous these days sort of data that show that if you look at, so we sort of put people through various kinds of experiments, you can show that people have automatic associations whereby they associate blacks with good and blacks with bad, oops, and whites with good, and that's something automatic associations test, and that same kind of set of associations happen when you're talking about women in leadership positions. And I won't go into all of the people who are who do these studies, and the general idea is that people can override these issues. They can sometimes override their kind of automatic responses, and the most typical way to override them, or the most useful way frequently to override them, at least in the individual case, is through recategorization. So if you think of a particular person not as an African American, but as an African American professional or an African American executive, well, that really does change entirely the way your automatic associations will function. Now, unfortunately, that kind of recategorization, it turns out, works a bit less well for women when you're trying to deal with women in leadership positions, and that may be because gender is, as a matter of fact, one of the very first categories that we learn when we're growing up, and also because it is a defining sort of, if you will, functional cue in the world about how men and women are distributed in social roles in society. And so it has informative value in that particular sense. Now, whatever one wants to attribute the media perceptions or the general public perceptions of, say, Hillary Clinton or Sarah Palin, whatever you want to attribute those things to, it is the case that automatic sort of processes that involve categorical judgments really do end up mattering in social perception. So what I'd like to focus on and try to be quick is two factors in social perception that it turns out really matter. And those two factors are competence and warmth. And those two factors are often considered to be universal in social perception and social judgment, particularly as according to the different kinds survey research and experimental research of Susan Fiske at Princeton. And what she basically argues is that those are two dimensions along which people are judged. Now, clearly, in the warmth dimension, in the competence dimension, if you are considered to be competent, then you're going to be respected. You're going to be seen as capable. If you're incompetent, let's face it, that's a deal breaker for taking on leadership roles. And these are sort of how various groups of people are clustered in ratings that undergraduates and other people make of different groups of people. Now, these particular clusters come out in various ways, but the bottom line, depending on who's doing the rating, but the bottom line is that it always tends to look more or less like this. So if you are doing well on the competence dimension, then you are at least in the running. But on the other hand, there is the warmth dimension, and the warmth dimension is really about how likely are you to approach this person, how likely are you to want to spend time with the person or to endorse the person in some fundamental way. And if that is not if you're not regarded highly in that way, then you also have another sticking point. Now, one of the problems is even with recategorization, you frequently find African Americans, if you will, struggling to find themselves or get themselves into the upper right-hand quadrant where they are viewed both as warm and as human and as sort of engaging and nurturing and so on, as well as being highly competent professionals. And certainly that is the case for women. So the trick is basically to get yourself into that warm and competent quadrant. And one of the kinds of evidence that exists is that women, just to go back to the gender issue, are frequently penalized. When in fact you are a woman leader, you are by definition taking part in a role violation. You are essentially violating what is assumed to be the nature of women, that you should be nurturing and caring and kind. If you are in a leadership role, you are by definition tough, particularly if you're running for political office or vying for the highest office in the land. You obviously, by definition, are exiting those traditional expectations. Now, so that's kind of the struggle that you're faced with. In terms of the Hillary Clinton campaign, one of the things that was, on the utmost on the mind of folks in the campaign was this whole issue of, will a woman ever be regarded as sufficiently strong and capable and knowledgeable and informed to be regarded as ready to be commander-in-chief? Okay, so that is, without question, the issue that was on the campaign's mind from the beginning. And it turned out that quite happily, if you look at the polls all through 2007 and all through 2008, really, she had surpassed that threshold. People did regard her as being commander-in-chief. Unfortunately, people at the top of the campaign didn't believe the polls. So they basically thought, wait a minute, this is not a done deal. So there were people like me and others, arguing within the campaign that, look, this is a done deal. She's already done this, and she is, we got to get ready for a backlash here, because she is going to be penalized for this. This is not going to go over well. Eventually, it is going to raise its head. And, anyway, that was taken started to be taken very seriously come December, but not seriously enough. It became taken seriously enough way too late in the campaign, according to those of us who care about such things. And then I would say, it should have really been, on the agenda all along. So in any event, it was not. But the idea is that the result of being, of really doing well in that commander-in-chief dimension, what ended up happening is that she was, hit with the stereotypes that commonly plague women in leadership positions, that she's cold and calculating and selfish, that she has no heart, that she's really not a woman at all, and really, what she really is that word that rhymes with witch, as Barbara Bush famously once exclaimed. And so that her challenge really was to be a very strong leader and a fighter for people, while still allowing somehow her more personal self, her more vulnerable self, quote unquote, not easy, and her more communal female qualities to show through. Now, on a different note, vis-a-vis this particular graphic here, I mean, if you think about somebody like Sarah Palin, she, leapt onto the public stage, a total unknown. Immediately, people regarded her because of her family, because of her accent, because of her nature, I guess, or the way she conveyed herself, as a highly traditional woman. And so she was regarded as warm. She was regarded as, all of those positive things that go along with that. But very, very quickly, of course, the question was posed, well, what about this commander-in-chief business? And she almost immediately began the descent down the competence dimension, which really one cannot afford as a woman, or as anyone for that matter, when running for the presidency. So whatever one thinks about the truth of Sarah Palin's competencies, which I will not comment on, what is clear is that she is fitting this problem and fitting it to the T. So let me quickly show you some very, very simple little studies that portray this and give you a feel for what it looks like, so that you can see, and there are many, many, many studies like this, so I'm just going to make this really simple and give you some really easy ones to digest in a very short period here. And that is a simple set of studies done by Madeline Heilman and her students at NYU. And basically what she does is she just says, okay, look, I'd like you to evaluate. She gives, she's going to have either undergraduates be subjects in these studies, or other kinds of people from the community be subjects in these studies. And she basically asks them, look, I want you to evaluate 2 executives and tell me what your responses are to these executives. One is Andrea and one is James. And basically, half of the group of people sees the resumes, resume number 1 with Andrea and resume number 2 with James. And then the other half of the respondents see those resumes switched, okay? So when you're averaging across everybody, basically the resumes are absolutely identical, okay? So that's basically the story we're dealing with. So basically, what does this look like? Let's just look at the competence issue. And I wanted to raise the other issue. What if the woman's, one could argue that Sarah Palin's credentials are very, very low, but what if it's merely ambiguous? What if the accomplishments of the individual are merely ambiguous? Okay, what happens then? So here what we have is, here are the clearly successful people. The good news is that Andrea and James are regarded as equally competent when, as a matter of fact, their competence is absolutely crystal clear. Okay, so that's the good news. That ain't bad, actually, as things go. But what happens when both of them are ambiguously successful? Well, there what we have is, okay, wait a minute, this is not so good. We have a significant difference where he is given, James is given the benefit of the doubt in terms of his competencies, and Andrea is not. Okay, so that's the first story. What about liking here? One might ask, how are these people regarded in terms of liking, which is really, like I said, that warmth dimension, if the prior success is either crystal clear or not crystal clear. But if it is crystal clear, is there some kind of penalty that the woman is going to receive for basically being out of role? Is there a catch-22 for women? And basically what you see is, for the clearly successful case, the man is liked a great deal. People think he's terrific. He's a really great person. And as far as Andrea, she's, well, actually, yuck. This is not your cup of tea. On the other hand, if they're both ambiguously successful, oh, she's terrific. She's just fine. And they're equally fine. So there's a penalty associated with success. Okay. So then you might say, all right, well, is there anything that we can do about this? Can it be counteracted in some way? Obviously, you must be able to counteract this. Well, how might that be done? Well, one of the ways you can do that is by providing a little bit of kind of communal information about the woman. Somehow indicating, showing her warmth, showing that maybe she's a mother, or something like that, and likewise that the dad is a man. That the man is a dad. And so what happens then? So let's take the no information again. How much do you like the person? Well, the liking is not so hot. Okay, once again, she's disliked. But when you let people know, you really emphasize, look, I'm a mom, I do this, I do that, I care for these people, I love my children, I love my family, I do the right thing, then really things go very well again. The liking thing is okay, so we're doing well. And then you might say, all right, well, what about the competence dimension? Do you want this person as your boss? Would you select this person as your boss? Again, if there's no information, no other information, you really don't want to select this person as your boss, okay? You don't want to vote for the person if you put it like that. On the other hand, when the communal information is there, you're all right, okay? The two, there's a parity now, again, between these folks. Okay, so that's basically what these kinds of data look like, and you might say, all right, so there are some solutions. We can be home free and clear, life can be good, but then on the other hand, there are some other things you have to say, but wait, it's not actually so easy, and why is that? For quite a surprising reason, one might argue, and that is, and I don't have a graphic for this, unfortunately, sorry, and that is that when the woman both has very high competency and has all of these communal things, okay, she's fabulous, that's great, let's we like her, we think she's good, we'll even vote for her, and so on. On the other hand, what then happens? The women take one look at her and they think, oh my God, Ms. Perfection, Superwoman, look at her, she's got it all, she has everything, who the hell does she think she is anyway? And moreover, I feel like crap, I don't feel so hot about myself by comparison, I feel inadequate, okay? So basically, women's own self-esteem as viewers starts, shooting way down. Okay, another big problem, another minefield. So what happens next? Well, the good news here, just cutting to the chase, is that you can do something here, and what you can do is reach out to people and let them know that really my candidacy or my existence in this position, in this leadership role, opens doors for you too. It opens doors for you too. It speaks for all that you can do and all that you can be and all that we can accomplish. In other words, we're in this together, and so on and so on and so on. And when you do that, suddenly this thing for women, this deficit for women, changes altogether. And they are back with you. Life is okay. They think this is relevant to them, and so on. And on that note, it might be an apt sort of note to sort of remind you if, oops, hello, I didn't even get to that. Sorry, what is this? Okay. It might be an interesting little moment to remind you of an election night speech that Hillary Clinton gave in Ohio. This was toward the last half of the 6-month primary season, where she was winning really lots of those last primaries. And so the media was lambasting her as usual and so on, but they had begun to do a brand new thing, which is, at least according to my phrasing of it, try to hound her out of the race before the primaries were over. And in any event, those findings that I just described tell you something about why she used the language that she used, and also why it was so resonant with certain people, and it turns out men and women alike who were her supporters. And what is some of that language? Well, as you may remember, for everyone who across America who has ever been counted out but refused to be knocked out, for everyone who has stumbled but stood right back up, and for everyone who works hard and never gives up, this one is for you, okay? And so with that kind of language, she was bringing people back in. She was bringing women with her and bringing men with her as well, who were not always perfect and always flawless, and so on. But of course you could say, why should I care about this? First of all, it's about executives. It's not about a lot of these data. It's not about politicians. And this is, of course, on elections and gender and race and so on. And I would say because the findings that exist, and there are plenty other ones besides those that I showed you, are across a wide range of leadership roles, and have been shown using multiple methods multiple times. So that's one kind of a thing. And one could argue that if, that this was an experiment, and there are political correctness issues in experiments that are some people sometimes feel, and as a result, you could say that if this were not conducted in that kind of a context, it might, these kinds of findings might even be more pronounced. But you could still say, but what about actual voting behavior and the privacy of the voting booth? Why should this really matter? And what I would say is, obviously, voting is multiply determined. I mean, ideology matters, right? Policy matters. All kinds of things matter. So that said, in terms of whether these issues matter, I would still say that the answer is yes. And yet I have to acknowledge that that remains to be tested. It is very hard to test these things in an ecologically sensible way, because basically we've got, what do you say, the privacy of the voting booth. But we do know that most decisions people make are in fact driven a lot more by emotion and gut reactions than as rational beings most of us would prefer to believe, and certainly vastly more so than traditional economists would prefer to believe. And finally, I would say that evidence from psychological science and behavioral and cognitive science is informing political campaigns right now more than ever before in this particular election season, or should I say this electoral 2 years that we've been in. And whether it's judgment and decision making, which is a very important field, or social cognition, or research on emotion, or research on self-regulation, this kind of evidence is being filtered into campaigns this year and placed in front of political candidates in these elections, the actual candidates themselves, and everybody is digesting this stuff and using this stuff right here and now, and it continues to be true in the general. To position the candidate, to frame and hone messages, and all kinds of things like that. So personally, I feel honored to have been, involved in Hillary Clinton's history-making campaign for the presidency, and she did come within a hair's breadth of the nomination. I wish I had been able to have a little bit more voice or impact than I did have, but oh well, as they say, it ain't beanbag. And just to end on another little note, to remind you of one kind of a comment that we encountered very early in the primaries, and you may remember this, iron my shirt, which was one of the hecklers in the crowd. So on that note, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
I'd like to start the questioning in a sense by asking Susan a question related to the Hillary Clinton campaign, and I'm going to offer a contrary scenario, which I actually think is consistent with the argument that you make. From a political scientist point of view, I might argue that because the race was essentially tied, as you pointed out, in terms of between the two Democratic, the most successful Democratic candidates for the nomination, that really she had successfully overcome the gender issue, that despite the rather hideous media treatment that she received, that she managed to really to do well and to actually do better among men in some respects than her opponent did, particularly white males. So one alternative scenario to argue why Senator Clinton is not the nominee is really 2 points, one of which is relevant here. So the one that's not relevant is that Senator Clinton assumed that she would have the nomination wrapped up on Super Duper Tuesday, and so she was not organized on the ground in the states that immediately followed that, and it took her 6 weeks essentially to rebuild an organization. And again, she started being successful after that period of time. That's not really relevant to the point that I want to make. The part that is that that's probably the single biggest issue that undid her going into the campaign was her vote for the Iraq War. That is, the vote for the Iraq War is what became the impetus for her to be outflanked on the left by an insurgent candidate with grassroots support, which ultimately was Senator Obama. And so one possible argument is, did Senator Clinton vote for the Iraq War in part because of that gender-based need to, the gender-based challenge of demonstrating commander-in-chief credentials, of being strong enough, hard enough? Do you think, in a sense, that the Iraq War and that issue catches her in a double bind? And that would be gonna.
Well, it certainly does. Sorry, it certainly does place her in a double bind. No question about that. Or could have placed her in a double bind. And but on the other hand, I don't want to speak for Senator Clinton on this, but what I would say, just based on what I know she believes, is that it was not about that for her. It was about the argument that was made to her repeatedly. And I know that a lot of people who are opposed to the war, really don't buy this explanation, okay? But from her point of view, and from the point of view of many people in Congress, they did not want George Bush to go to war. But what they did want was the UN to force the inspectors back in, okay? So that is now, it is an argument that she offered at the time on the floor of the Senate, and it's what she offered in the campaign. When she did offer it in the campaign, after a little bit of hubbub of whatever else, it was never mentioned again. It was basically rarely mentioned after that as an issue. I don't think it had to do with her positioning herself to run, because if you look at Joe Biden, if you look at all of these other, most of the people in the Senate, obviously the majority, did vote for this, and those who were highly ambivalent about it, and Hillary was highly ambivalent about it. If you read her speech on the floor of the Senate, you'd be hard-pressed to know which way she was actually voting, given what she said. And now you could argue, well, that's all, conniving, or whatever one wants to say about it. But from her point of view, she thought it was an enormously complex problem, because if he does have weapons of mass destruction, and we don't know, there's no way for us to find out unless we get the inspectors back in. So, that was the deal. But from the point of view of your larger point is, are there other factors that were at play in the primary beyond gender issues? And the answer is, of course, there were huge numbers of issues. And the issues in the first one you mentioned, is enormous. That was like the most enormous strategic blunder from my point of view. What to be done about it? Nothing. It was not wise. And I also totally agree with the point that, how could one argue with the point that there is a very large faction of the Democratic Party that was livid about the war and wished that it had never happened, and that the Senate never voted as it had, and therefore she was the person who was the recipient of a lot of that. But I really don't think that. Well, one could argue that exactly the argument you made, and I have no evidence where I could actually dispute it.
You did great. That's great.
Yeah.
Please join me again in thanking Professor Andersen. And hold on to that microphone. Hold on to the microphone and have a seat. And I'm going to ask the other two panelists to come up and grab a microphone and have a seat. And we are going to entertain some of the questions that were passed to me from audience members, and I have questions for every panelist. Weirdly, even a question that I think I'm best suited to answer, so I'll read it. Latinos have long been perceived as the sleeping giant and were expected to have a tremendous impact in this election. However, much of this discussion seems to remain in terms of black and white. Has Senator Obama's race transcended in the eyes of Latino voters in the same way it has in the eyes of white voters? That's a very good question. There was a somewhat ridiculous trope put into the media about the racial relationships between blacks and Latinos, in particular during the Democratic primaries. And the argument was that Latinos would not vote for a black candidate. That was introduced in a Wall Street Journal interview that Sergio Ben-Dixon, who was Hillary Clinton's Latino pollster, basically answered a question that way in an interview. There is no evidence for that, and in fact, Latinos have consistently voted for black candidates in circumstances when given the opportunity to. So this is true for David Dinkins and Harold Washington and Wellington Webb, people who've been elected mayoralities of cities with large Latino populations. And there's just no evidence of this. And in fact, Barack Obama's initial elections were in districts that had substantial Latino populations. We've done some recent polling, and the polling suggests that right now Obama is attracting between 65 and 70% of the Latino vote. And Senator McCain is only attracting about 18%, with the remainder undecided. So the high watermark for Latinos voting Republican was 2004. Where somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of Latinos voted Republican. The low water mark was Senator Dole's campaign in 1996, where only about a quarter of Latinos voted Republican. John McCain's performance looks like it's going to be much more akin to Bob Dole's than to George Bush's, and so I think Obama has done quite well among Latinos. So that's my answer to that question. I would be happy to have the panelists speak to that, but I don't know. No one mentioned Latinos tonight, so I figured I would. But I have two questions from the audience for each of the panelists, so I'll just kind of go down the row and ask them. This first question is directed to Professor Iyengar. We talk about the Bradley effect, but could there be a reverse of this effect? That is, are there people who would never tell anyone that they were voting for a black man who may in fact go and vote for Obama? And do you think this could significantly affect the race?
Well, it's hard to say. We can speculate. The Bradley effect itself is the subject of a lot of editorializing and a lot of commentary, but if you look at the actual hard facts, we don't have much data since the very fact that there was a sort of a period between the candidacy of Bradley and the candidacy of Obama, well, there was Jesse Jackson in between, tells you something about the state of race relations in this country. But I think that's a good point, that I think we haven't yet adequately addressed the possibility that there may be other kinds of racial bias, if you will, not necessarily those that might be adverse, that might be injurious to the African American candidate. I would say a lot of this would depend on the immediate context that the individual happens to be in. So I can think of certain areas where there would be more pressure on people to conceal a pro-Obama choice as opposed to the other opposite conventional logic. So I guess I'm not sure. What do you think, Gary? I mean, I would pretty much say it's possible, but perhaps implausible.
Particularly among communities who are likely to be voting Democrat in the first place. So I think I would agree with you. Possible, but not a strong likelihood. Okay, great. The second question is for Professor Valerie Smith. Do you believe that Senator Obama's race could make him hesitant to support legislation that would significantly and specifically aid minorities, particularly the black community? That is, would a reluctance to talk about race affect policymaking in an Obama administration?
I think it could. Yes, I do. The other factor I think to take into account and I realize that I don't know exactly how to negotiate this. I mean, I do think that Senator Obama is at heart, I think some of his success, or much of his success, is a function of his pragmatic approach to politics. I think he is, it seems to me, at heart, a sort of a moderate person. So it's also possible that positions that he that are deeply felt for him might be positions that communities of color might feel disadvantage them. So I don't know that I would necessarily see this as always being strategic on his part. There's a level at which I think some positions we might find that he could take would actually be heartfelt on his position. So from his perspective. So yeah, I do think that it's possible. I think this is why, again, we have to take into account the fact that should he win, this is just the beginning of our trying to keep him and his administration accountable. So that would be my response to that.
Great, thank you. This next question is Professor Susan Andersen. So if traditional women leaders and those running are frequently seen in a negative light for being either too much like a, quote, man, or also seen as not competent or too soft if they're too, quote, female, how does the candidate win? And specifically, when you want to talk about the processes that would allow female candidates to be successful in the future, what is that going to take? What form of social change? Is that different education regarding sexes? Is it the presence of additional women in public office? Does it require a different type of woman to run? And I'm not sure what that means, but okay.
Well, I think the good news is that some of the data that we have tell us something about exactly what needs to happen. I mean, the probability of her doing well is going to go way up when she has children, when she is a mom, when she is there with her kids, when she talks about that aspect of her life, as well as policies and being a tough debater and that kind of thing. So that's one sort of issue, and making sure that women are not off-put by any kind of image of superwoman. So that's kind of what I've already said. Beyond that, one of the things that seems to be pretty clear from the literature in my field anyway, is that people are far more aware of and more likely to acknowledge the presence of racism in society, and they're really not wanting to be seen as racist, not wanting to be racist, not wanting to make decisions or engage in behavior that is racist or prejudiced in some way, and therefore people they monitor themselves, and they are more likely to correct or to stop themselves before doing certain kinds of things or making certain kinds of biased judgments. This is kind of along the lines of what you were saying about, ads that are explicitly playing on race, don't necessarily work all that well. Why? Because if it's super explicit, because people start saying, well, wait a minute, I don't want to respond to that in some sort of biased way, and so on. Now, the problem is that there is a lot less awareness of, people think that things are done with the problems with sexism, that really is not around anymore, that it's not such a big deal, that basically we're okay now. And, that is where perhaps education could matter. If people became more and more aware somehow that this remains as much of a, and I think actually the election was quite a learning experience for a lot of people about just exactly what can happen to women in political office. So, I think that education and so on would be helpful. I think it would also be helpful if we allowed somehow, if we could find a way to allow more diversity in the kinds of women that are considered acceptable, just in terms of gender norms. And a lot of this stems ultimately from the distribution of men and women into social roles in society. Unfortunately, given that women are the ones who bear the children and frequently take care of them, it's biologically hard to figure out how to exit, some of this. And certainly anthropologists, that's their argument. Evolutionarily oriented anthropologists would make that kind of argument. So I'm not sure. I don't have the silver bullet.
Okay. I've got 3 questions here that all speak in different ways to race, gender, and their intersections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose the 3 questions and then ask each of you in turn to sort of deal with them as a group. And 3 questions sounds like a lot, but as you hear them, you'll understand why I'm posing them together. So the first question is, we talk about the Bradley effect and wonder if it's going to undermine the vote for Barack Obama. Had Hillary Clinton been the Democratic nominee, could we perceive of a gender-based Bradley effect, and is there any evidence for it? The second question is, there is a construction of the history of the Democratic primary this year as sort of blacks versus women, but there was not a real discussion tonight and about particularly the perceptions of African American women and how they reacted to the primary race, and how might the 3 of you respond to that. And the third is about the Sarah Palin effect, and it's really a question about double standards. So the question reads, why is it that the Obama campaign must be so sensitive with Governor Palin's gender and yet downplay the effect of race in the election, while the McCain campaign feels free to use Palin's gender in order to appear victimized? So we're talking again about the intersections of race and gender in the election, and Professor Iyengar, I'll let you go first.
Okay, I'm trying to keep track of the of the questions. I think the first question about whether there's a parallel sort of I guess we'd have to say, instead of saying a Bradley effect, maybe there's a Dianne Feinstein effect or a Barbara Boxer effect or something to the effect where people will understate their preference for a woman. I think I would agree with Professor Andersen here that I think the normative strength, I believe, is, I don't think people realize when they're considering a choice between a male and a female, I don't think they realize that there are, if I say I'm going to vote for the man, I'm going to be perceived as a sexist. I don't think that is as strong as the comparable perception that if I say I'm going to vote for Senator McCain, I might be thought to be a racist. So I think it's this latter argument that's much stronger, and which creates the incentive, if you will, for people to conceal their preference. So my guess is that if there was a parallel sort of an effect in the area of gender, it would not be as strong. I don't know if you would agree or.
I agree entirely with that, and as a matter of fact, just to use an anecdotal case in point, the polls, if you take Hillary's 2000 election, for example, the polls at that time suggested she was doing well, and so on and so on, but nobody expected a landslide. And so really there was a total, a kind of reverse Bradley effect in a sense there, where people were happy to complain about Hillary in the standard ways that people are happy to complain about Hillary. And that's sort of what was going on in New York. And especially if you were further to the left, you might, complain about her, being centrist, or Bill being centrist, or why didn't she leave him, or et cetera, et cetera. But in the privacy of the voting booth, that was apparently not at all how it played out. And that was even more true, even more of a landslide the following year. So, I really don't see it that way. But
let's shift a little bit to the question of African American women and their sort of unique place. And I'll let Professor Smith go first.
Yeah, I certainly felt from the primary season all the way to the present, I've been really sort of struck by the ways in which racial categorizations, the sort of discontinuous ways in which racial categorizations as adjectives get used. So that, for example, I think, any number of voters, feminists of color, would notice that when generalizations were being made about women's votes, particularly women's support for Senator Clinton, inevitably that when that category was unmarked, it was taken to mean white women, and sort of white women weren't spoken, and the category of whiteness was not spoken as a modifier for women in general. And then when people sort of talked about the support of black voters for Obama, black women were sort of subsumed under the category of blackness. So I think we saw in the context of the primaries that sort of typical erasure of black women as a specified as a specific demographic. Now, my sense of sort of as someone who watched coverage of in the primary season, it was clear that there was certainly a diversity of opinion among African American women in terms of their support for the spectrum of candidates. I mean, now I don't have access to the numbers, and perhaps my colleagues do. It seemed to me that, as far as I could tell, a majority of black women were supportive of Obama, but that certainly didn't mean that that was the case across the board. And there were certainly black women who were active in Senator Clinton's campaign, black women who were interviewed in the media, who supported her, and who took pride in the fact that they could define themselves as in opposition to a kind of monolithic perception of a sort of unified black community vote. So I think that it's important for that to be spoken, for that point to be identified. There is also, I think this is implicit in what Professor Iyengar mentioned about some of the sort of the codes that were used later in the Clinton campaign about hardworking Americans, the sort of, again, this category of who counts as sort of real Americans. And so that was was obviously implicit in what I was, in my reading from Melissa Harris Lacewell's blog, right? I mean, the point that I was trying to get at there was had to do with the ways in which black women in particular, but a whole host of other kinds of people who represent other demographic groups get kind of exempted from the category of the real American. But it seemed to me that part of what was striking to me about the example from Melissa Harris Lacewell's blog was her desire to be able to mark a space for black women as capable of being part of a sort of representative population of Americans, to count as sort of a population of real Americans and not to be excluded on the basis of race and gender. So I think that we've seen many instances of sort of whiteness being a monolith and blackness being a monolith, and black women somehow getting written out of both of those populations.
Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time for the third question, which had to do with whether or not the McCain campaign has more latitude about race and gender than the Obama campaign. So the answer is yes. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their very good presentations tonight.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.